I just had a question for each of you, if you don't mind. And of course, if you want to jump in on anyone else's question, feel free to do that. So many thoughts and themes, I thought there's lots of overlap as well. And then afterwards, you guys feel free to jump in with your questions. So Katrina, I wanted to come to you first, if you don't mind. Obviously, you spoke a lot about this kind of fractured relationship between the police and black communities. And I think particularly after George Floyd in 2020, we heard lots of conversations about reform, right? And then ideas of abolition too, and what that would look like. I just wondered for you, is reform possible? What would that look like? Or is it time to think of an entirely new way of approaching justice? That would be my question. Thank you.
A very meaty one.
Sorry.
no apologies. Please back away from those. Thank you. So when I set up Unjust, it was about reimagining policing and promoting public safety, because the narrative is that the police keep the public safe without any recognition of the harm that's caused. And it's not to fudge it, but it was recognising that because of the nature of this country, the paradigm of language, that being too forceful with your message won't get stuff done. So I actively don't use the words defund the police, because of this, I don't think it's toxic, but because of the dog whistle it brings to the people I want to engage with. And I think having conversations around reimagining policing, what does that look like, opens up the door for us to speak about abolition, speak about prevention. But just landing it in the American context, I think just gets white people framed. So, and it's not I want to scare nobody, but if I want to change hearts and minds and have that nuance, I don't think it's useful for me to start with having to bring them into the room. I don't want no one to run away. So I'm very much around how do you think it could be reformed, because we've been trying to reform it and it's not being reformed. And for people that are not reformists, how do you think we could restructure this so that there's a conversation for the people who think we can still keep tinker at the edges, and for the people that think it needs to be burned down and raised again, and have that conversation. Whereas I think as an organisation, if I came with this is what needs to be done, it's really narrow. So I want to be a conduit for the space for those conversations to happen, but not necessarily lead. And I just say it not because I'm scared, but after years of doing this, I want to be able to walk in the room and have the dialogue for where we need to go, and not have to spend 10 minutes getting into that position. So it is a bit, I don't want to say like I'm a wuss, but I want to, you get to a point where you pick your battles, and having terminology that enables the conversation to move or the dial, I find really useful, but that has to be caveated with my personal belief is the system cannot be fixed because of the colonial roots of policing, and most people are unaware of that. So it's a whole education piece around, for black people, what does policing mean, how does it mean here, and also its connection to private property and capitalism. And I have a disrespect for police officers, but they usually come from the working class. I haven't seen many middle class police officers until now. Recently, you can come with a degree. So understanding that when we speak about abolition and reform, that it means different things to different groups, but also in terms of who's policing, there'll be some that think that there's nothing wrong with the system and it doesn't need to be done, and we just need to open spaces for people who want to challenge that. I think I might fudge the answer, but
no.
Yeah, I'm going to stop there. But really just saying, more cannot be done with the system as it is. But I don't think there's enough people having conversations around what it looks like differently. So we're in this gap of we keep doing the same until we've developed a thing, but there just needs to be more conversations with people about what does that look like. So really welcome if there are people that are on that kind of trajectory of burn down Babylon. Please do get in touch with me.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And then Sharon, I want to come to you next, if that's okay. Speaking about the Windrush generation, which I'm now using these for. We've heard a lot, and there have been a few programs on recently about their experiences of schooling, right, and education when they first came over, and how the education system essentially failed them, right, and put them into these streams and schools that weren't ever there to protect them, right, or harness their potential, but were there to actively kind of disadvantage them, right, and set them back. And so with your experience, you know, as a primary school teacher and your part and the work you do now as well with the education system, I just wondered, why do you think it's still so important to look at black children's experiences of schooling today?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a particularly good question because the work that I do in schools in London, I work with school leaders in London because they were, at the time of the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, there were already things happening in the schools, but it kind of galvanised them. They kind of felt that they really had to kind of bring their work together and to really act, to find a way to support children in schools. But it's interesting because although it's a London borough, it's a mixture actually. It's a London borough, but black children are not the only communities. There's large Asian communities. And then also, because we're in an environment of equality and diversity, it actually makes it very difficult for school leaders to put their resources on one group of children in ethnic terms. Because there's a sort of discomfort with that, because there's a sense of, even if you're able to recognise that children from certain black backgrounds, often Caribbean heritage, are not doing as well in schools, as school leaders they find it very difficult to justify how they will not support other children from black minority ethnic groups. And so I think we're in a kind of conundrum at the moment. So even though there are lots of teachers who are have been inspired or influenced by Black Lives Matter, they no longer know how to act on behalf of black students because the environment doesn't allow them to do so, because then you're then accused of almost like ethnic favoritism. So even though there's a recognition that these many children from these communities are still not, they're not flourishing in schools, there's no real know-how of how you get around that in our current environment. But if anyone else out there might have other things. It doesn't mean it cannot be done, because obviously people are doing that, but it's recognition that in our current climate it is difficult for school leaders to do that, because someone will come and knock on the school gate and say, what about my child? Do you know what I mean? Or if Ofsted comes, it's great you're doing that, but what about this group of children? And in particularly lots of talk around the white working class, who are I shouldn't say apparently, sorry. Who are, okay, maybe they're not doing as well in the system, but not as bad as the media might make you think in relation to other groups. It becomes difficult for schools to prioritise black students within that environment, which I think is quite, if we were a part of a conspiracy, you could say, interesting that it's worked out that way, that we can no longer target this group. It's become difficult to do so.
That's super interesting. And it actually leads on to what I wanted to ask you, Christiana, about when we hear these kind of narratives about why are black children failing in schools or underperforming in schools, I think the black family gets brought up quite a lot. And this idea that if you come from a single parent household, that's the problem. I just wondered, with the work that you've been doing on like family breakdown, as it were, what you think about those arguments, and whether you do think it's important to look at the black family as a cause for these issues.
Oh, that's a huge question. I think it's so complex, and I think we've reached a point where there's a point at which, particularly when we talked about like issues with the black community, and and in Canada where I work and live, I mean we're right there, grappling with this idea of blackness and what it is to be black Canadian, and a lot of flattening happened around the discourses around that. So blackness is white, kind of very clear cut. But I think even with what I'm doing around this, it's so complex, because we talk about a systemic migration, in this case, a migration phenomenon, the Windrush, within a context, a colonial context, an imperial context. And then, of course, the complications now of life in the Caribbean. And I think there's a tendency oftentimes to naively idealize societies and groups and the family, the ideal family, and to understand that this sort of wider space within which these families are located and these communities and these so-called countries are located gives us such heavy burdens to carry. So that I think we need to walk away from this naive idealism. And to understand violence and to understand, internal violence, and when we talk about these kinds of structures of countries, so it's complex, and I think those kinds of real conversations have to happen, because we can no longer approach this at a very surface level. And when we talk about race, and that kind of thing, so hard to there's no one answer as far as I'm concerned. It requires very deep discussion and reflection.
Thank you so much. No, it definitely does. Thank you so much. Okay, now it's you guys' turn. If you have any questions you'd like to pose to the panel, please feel free to go ahead and start with your questions. But if not, I have others. So I can ask one. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Dr.
Christiana.
It's personal, I've just been nosy. How old was you when you actually came to England?
I never came.
Oh, no, sorry, to Canada then.
I came to Canada. I went to Canada as an adult. I went to university. I had already worked. I was working in the media. I had some exposure to media work and so on. And my grandmother had died. So it was only after my grandmother died, because I always wanted to go to university. Because my friends, people I knew, were going to university. And I decided that when she passed, it was the moment to go. And so I applied to universities, else anywhere but not England. Anywhere but England. Right? So I applied to the University of the West Indies, and I applied to Canada. And of course, Canada was quite exotic, and so I decided to go check out some snow, right? So
I think it's very interesting because we speak about a Windrush generation and stuff, and some of us we've got siblings that were left behind and who probably never ever came, and those who did come, we have conversations with them who never really felt it or heard it from the perspective that you gave it. So it's sort of like, oh my gosh, imagine how they felt and how they're feeling, and it's quite deep. We were sitting there saying, oh my God, that is so deep, because I've never heard it from that side before. It's really interesting, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you again for sharing that personal story. I have sisters who were left behind, but eventually came, so they weren't completely left behind. But I just wonder, how far back do we go? Because before migration to Britain, there's migration to North America, before the McLaren-Walter Act. There are people from the West Indies who go to Cuba, Venezuela, going back even to the late 1800s, where there are these kind of ruptures in family life. Some people don't see a parent for 5 years, 10 years, some never return. So I just wonder, do we frame this within a larger history, or is this post-1945 period unique?
I think this is a really good point, and I think we can do both, right? I think we can't step away from analyzing this in terms of like a wider historical kind of context. But I think the Windrush is particular in its, its kind of articulations. I mean, more so that we're alive and we're experiencing this. So that alone, sets it apart. It's our lives, it's our experiences. So I think we tend to see this in another kind of way. But certainly, the idea of movement. Although I think the out movement, we have to think about the out movement from the Caribbean in different ways as well, because I think the Windrush was the first sort of opportunity where you had this mass kind of movement. Where they were actually literally soliciting people to come and register to go, like literally, getting you to go. And so you had this idea of thousands of people living at the time. I remember hearing about when I was a child, because of course I grew up with old people, so I know all these old stories about older people, this other generation. That's all I did as a kid, listen to these stories. But I remember there was, particularly for Dominica, which is a very small, insignificant island, to a certain extent, there was migration out to Curacao. People went to work in these other parts, but it was for very short periods. Let's say the father went, but he came back, right? So, but I think the Windrush does offer a very unique kind of view on that type of migration, and we're seeing it now actually repeated in the sense there's this, and I think some of the research that's being done. There's no research. There's hardly anything done on the Windrush children, on those left behind. What I'm talking about, but what is being done now is a lot of work by U.S. academics, or Caribbean U.S. academics, on what's happening now with the current migration around the United States in particular, particularly Jamaica and so on. And of course, and the whole idea of remittance children, that's a new term now. So that a lot of it's about wiring money back and forth, right? So I think there is quite a bit of uniqueness in this kind of phenomenon.
I was struck when I was just listening to all three of you speak, the notion of within the black experience, whether it be the family, education, policing, the justice system, how far do we allow within that for the black community, the black family, to work through the issues of the education system in this country, looking at the family, and it could be that in a few years' time, rather than talk about just the Windrush and those who were left behind, we'll be talking about black children who were placed in care or have been away from the family because there's some problem or issue, and how they are then seen by the family or integrated back into the family, or the issue of black, particularly young people, and the justice or police system. How far do we as a community work through some of those issues, and yet at the same time realise that we are in a society that we are one of a number of groups, we are not necessarily the dominant group. How do we avoid the pitfall of somehow being caught between two approaches that are needed, maybe the same approach or divergent approaches, whereby as black people we are at the cutting face or cold face of how the justice system treats us, yet we are within the dominant society. As a family, what is it about the family that we need to do, can do, at the same time in the wider world where the family is under pressure, we've got the cost of living that's about to occur. In education, as you said, Sharon, we are one of the groups competing for a voice within education, yet our needs are particular and haven't been met in the past. How do we ensure that those things are done? How does that dichotomy within each of the areas that you are involved in, how do we manage that? Do we look to ourselves? Do we look at fighting the bigger fight? Do we look for allies? And I'd just be interested to know how you might reconcile that. Where do we start first, or not?
They ain't right.
You can all. Do you have a good response?
No, I ain't got a response. I've got my own thing.
I guess we can take both, and then you guys can answer both at the same time if you wish. Yeah? Okay. I can take both questions now, and then they can kind of answer them at the same time.
I've always kind of found it interesting because some of my siblings were left behind in Jamaica. One of my siblings, so-called half-sister, didn't come because her mum didn't let her come. But crucially, I've never really heard anyone talk about those of us who were here who were denied our grandparents. Because loads of us who were born here never knew any grandparents. And I've never heard anyone do any research on that, so I don't know if you know anyone who's looking into that. Because I would say, if I grew up with 50 children from the Caribbean, 48 of us never knew our grandparents. And that kind of lost, for me, no one has ever really looked into that. Because I think that's an important aspect as well. Because those are the conversations, rightly or wrongly, I started with my siblings when they used to say, yeah, them left with them abandoned me. And I said, like, at least you had your grandparents. We never had that.
Okay, two really interesting questions. Do you have a direct response to that? Or?
Want to go first? Okay.
Yeah, go first.
Well, I think it's really important that you raise this. I didn't think about that, you know. But I think it speaks to the broader issue of this familial rupture, this broken ties, that all of these migrations, and I mean there's necessary economic migrations. I mean, what were they going to do in the Caribbean? Obviously, they had to leave. When I interviewed my mother for this, of course, we've had some conversations because, you know, we're working things through, and my mother had no choice as far as she was concerned. She had to leave. So we have this issue of the economic rationale that people have to go because of the colonial system. I mean, we have to go further back as well. You know, we're, you know, this colonial colony. There's like this excessive poverty and lack of jobs, and, you know, that's part of a much broader kind of structural system of relations and so on. And I think fundamentally the ruptures at all levels. So that I think this work has to be done in terms of those kinds of, and we tend not to think about the emotional costs and those kind of very deep costs. And yeah, it's a really important. My own sisters who came, quite reluctantly, my older sisters. My eldest sister never went back, and when you talk, she cries. I mean, she just never saw her grandparents. Her grandparents died, and she was very attached to them as well. So there's a very personal kind of, and most of the people think they shouldn't talk about it. It's hurt. There's a lot of hurt, And so, yes, those are lots of opportunities and avenues that we have a responsibility to think about, to investigate, to research, to uncover.
It's more of a reflection on that bit about grandparents being in the Caribbean and the youngest. My granddad came at 19, which I look back now and I'm just like, I rate him. He said, gee, how you come on the boat at 19 and built this big life? But then understanding for people of, let's just say in this room, 50 plus, how was it growing as you've got older to see no elders, or your parents now being the first set of meet elderly black people? Like that relationship of caring, as a caring duty, like to get elderly black people. And I think it's really just interesting that for my gran, she left her gran as a child, didn't go back and saw her, but now for her becoming older, my mum having to care for her mum, never having to care for her gran, whereas now for a second generation person, it's just normal for me to care for my gran. But for people like yourselves, if that elder person wasn't there, what is it now as people are getting older, or you are becoming the elders, in terms of our relationship as youngers? How do we do that? So just the kind of reflection on that, because the elders aren't there. We see, my mum said she didn't see no old people when she first came. Everybody was young, and then when she got to that point, she said, "Oh my God, everyone's got old out of nowhere." So that thing about that representation for the elders, because there wasn't very few people.
Really good point.
I think in response to Mark's question, I don't know all the audience's names, I just know. In response, I think that's it. So if I take education as an example, and thinking, because you asked the question, what do we as a community do in the cosmos, in the middle of the kind of bigger picture? And so the first couple of questions that came into my mind is that first of all, when we think about the black community, it becomes difficult because we're not homogenous. In the sense of, do we recognise similar issues? Because, for example, I have a friend, he's like, he's Jamaican heritage, roughly the same age, but when he looks at Black Britain or thinks about Black British, I would say that he's much more in line with like Tony Sewell's way of thinking, much more kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's nothing wrong with the system, it's not about institutional racism. So already we're not on the same conversation. So therefore, how do we act together? Because we're not seeing the same issues. And I think there was a program recently, I think it was Kahinda Andrews was in it, and it was called Black and British, I think, something like this. And I think that show was very revealing, because obviously you've now got first, second, third generation children of Caribbean descent, or Caribbean heritage, Black heritage, in Britain. Actually, I think some of them are of African heritage as well, I'm not sure. Yeah. But then, when I think about my parents, for example, and when they came over from the Caribbean, although they came from different Caribbean islands, they had very similar ways of seeing, whereas we're different. We're morphing all the time. We're not just a black culture that's stuck in time. We're constantly morphing, and so therefore, the way that we kind of understand issues of black children in education are not going to be as simply put as when we think back to, how can I forget his name? It's just gone out of my head.
Cool.
That's it, exactly. When he wrote about that's the very title, thank you. That's lovely. I kind of prepped him before. So I think it's a very different, I think it therefore becomes much more complicated for us to speak about what do we do, because we're a different community. And I say community loosely, because what do we mean when we talk about the black community? I get really irritated. Okay, this is me getting on my soapbox for a second. There's a channel on the telly, and it's called, I think it's on NR5 or something, and it describes itself as the channel you come to if you want to know about black culture.
Yeah?
What does that mean? Because already, I look around this room, we have a common history, I can hear your stories and I identify with you, but to think that we are the same, that we listen to the same music or eat that, I think is so simplistic, it's just unbelievable. But anyway, and so therefore, coming back to your answer, I think that we would need to start at the beginning, I think, and not assume that we all think in the same way, share the same ideologies, the same understanding of what's education. in the sense of what it means for our children, how they're experiencing it. So I think it comes down to an honest conversation of who we are, where we are, how we understand ourselves and vision ourselves, not in the UK simply as now, but going forward, I think.
Can I add a little something to that? That also includes Black Muslims as a community. Because I was a school governor one time that had a Black head teacher, and who spoke about the need, the school itself had a very large Muslim population, but mostly Asian Muslims. And she talked about a program in another school that was doing well helping Black students. And she then literally said in the governor's meeting, but we can't adopt that here because we don't have Black children. And I was like, what, there were loads of Black Muslims in the school. So thinking of your people categories, because they were categorized as Muslim, they somehow became un-Black, but they were getting the Black treatment as Muslims as well. So there's the assumption of, and like you said, I just giving that as a very concrete example of that need to think about beyond the categories of Black community and what that means.
Can I just quickly ask a very quick question? Okay. I just wanted to ask, just in terms of the research that's done around this, because you're saying the statistics speak, so you know who the groups are that are struggling, and that's always been the case. So it's like, so it would be possible to target those groups. So it means then that there's a climate of resistance against really just being clear and honest and open about where the resources need to go. And I'm thinking, like, in terms of how we make those changes, that starts at the top, that starts with public policy, that starts with a whole kind of, atmosphere of intolerance and phobia, where racism is constantly stoked. You want to avoid it, a scandal, target refugees or whatever. So it's like there's a climate at the moment that has really precipitated this situation. And then there's this kind of false idea about a meritocracy. There is no meritocracy, so it's not a neoliberalism. And so, I think there's massive changes that need to take place. And, a lot of work's been done over the years addressing these issues, but the facts speak for themselves, and it could be very clearly understood where those resources need to go, but we need a kind of real shift now. And I think it's starting to happen with your election, and it's like really need a much broader understanding that I think we've just got really flawed policies, and it's coming from the top in government right now.
And I think that's really, as you say, we know statistically, and not just statistically, even anecdotally, if you speak to teachers, they have a sense when they have students from Black backgrounds in their school, they know that those students are, when I say struggling, not because of the students, but because of the environment that they're in, that they're not doing as well as they could do. They know this. But then, as you say, a lot of the rhetoric that comes from the top makes it very difficult to target those group of students. But then this comes back to something that you were saying, Mark, when you think about the kind of supplementary school movement in the 70s, when you had communities who thought, forget the flipping top, let's just do something from the grassroots and support our children. And I think that there is a need still for that, because we recognise, we act, regardless of what's going on at the top. But I think it's because we are in such a culture, a school culture, of kind of accountability and measurement and metrics and diversity and equality, that sometimes it makes teachers feel constrained to act. And I think that's where the issue comes from, I think.
So I kind of had a question about the Windrush children who were left behind, Windrush children who were left behind in this country. So my mum...
In this country?
So my mum was born here in the late 60s, and like a few Nigerians at the time, she was left in the country, and my grandparents went to Nigeria, and that happened to quite a few West Africans, and I was just thinking about how that links to that and what you would have to say about that.
That's an interesting one. I mean, I think when you start talking about, you see the range of ideas that we can bring to the table in that discussion. So, and can I ask you, why did they go back to Nigeria?
So I think they mostly came here to ensure she was born here. And I guess that has allowed for my citizenship, my dad's citizenship, and all of that. So it worked, but I think it denied her a relationship with them. And then she was luckily sent for to come to Nigeria, only to be put in boarding school. So I think that's like definitely changed their relationship. So I'm just wondering how you would like theorize that rupture, because when she was left here as well, she was raised by white people as well. So yeah.
Right, can I just feed into that?
Yeah.
So I'm Nigerian as well, and what happened with your grandparents and my parents' generation was they came to the UK for an education.
Yeah.
And what you will find is a lot of Nigerians put their children in foster care so they could work, but their children would be taken care of. A lot of Nigerians, in fact, majority, all went back. But they couldn't necessarily afford, because back then in the 70s, there was one flight probably a month, but it was shipped, it took 10 days. So I went back on a ship 10 days when my father took out his family back. So what you're talking about is, and it isn't part of the Windrush generation, that's not the term, it's not the narrative, it's not the language. It was a completely different intention that Nigerians had, your grandparents. So I would say that it was due to probably a lack of funds that they couldn't get your mum to go back at the time, but when they could, they sent for her.
Yeah, but what I find interesting is that now people would call her Windrush. So how does that fit? Even though it might not.
She needs to correct.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's completely different.
Yeah.
I really don't want to halt this conversation. I love this. Honestly, I've never been to a conference before, but if this is what they're all like, I'm excellent. We're going to have a quick break now and reconvene at 4:25. So everyone can be in their seats then. And then we'll have an exciting keynote speaker after the break. So don't miss that. But thank you so much. Thank you.